Welcome to Calling All Voices, brought to you by Dementia Action Alliance and the Global Council on Alzheimer's Disease. My name is Deborah Tan, and I serve as a board member for Dementia Action Alliance. In the Calling All Voices podcast series, you will hear from people living with dementia and care partners from diverse communities. They will share their stories about resilience and persistence and how it can help people to continue to live meaningful lives, even with a diagnosis of dementia. And you will also hear these participants discuss why it is important that we call all voices to share their experiences.
Welcome to the podcast series, Calling All Voices. If you've been following along, you'll know that Calling All Voices is a project that's focused on hearing from the lived experiences of those often marginalized, underserved, and not heard from. My name is Jessica, and I have the privilege of being the host of this series of Calling All Voices that's focused on hearing from individuals from the Asian community. This podcast episode is really special because it's our final one in this series of Calling All Voices. I am so thrilled to be joined by three guests who helped us out with previous episodes. First, we have Mario. Mario hails from British Columbia, Canada. He is a well-known and highly respected dementia advocate in Canada, and he is someone who lives with a dementia diagnosis. Next, we have Cris. Cris is the care partner to her parents. She's an educator, advocate, community builder herself, and she has been bravely sharing some of her caregiving experiences on social media. So make sure to follow her. Cris is dialing in today from North Carolina, USA. And last but not least is Peter. Peter is a care partner to his father alongside his mother and brother. He is a tech executive who has a strong desire to help others in similar situations, and he has been so gracious in sharing his lived experience with us in this project. Peter is dialing in from California, USA today. Thank you all for joining us on this last episode. All of you have shared so much rich information that we thought it'd be really neat to bring you together to dive a bit deeper into some important lessons learned and your opinions on what are some of the key steps that we need to take in order to help people from the Asian community live better and cope better after a diagnosis with dementia. So welcome. All right, so in this episode, we have three key areas that we want to focus on, and I'm going to ask Mario first to answer this question, and then we'll go into inviting Cris and Peter to respond. But here's the question. What are one or two key lessons learned or advice you would give to people from the Asian community who are in similar situations as you are in?
Thank you for that question. That is a very interesting question. But first, let me reintroduce myself. I'm from one of the South Asian countries, specifically from the Philippines, and I'm 76 years old. I retired from a telecommunications company as a data analyst in 2007. 1 year later, I was diagnosed with vascular neurocognitive disorder or vascular dementia. Coming from a South Asian country, it is really sort of a challenge for me to find medical services that specifically cater to the South Asian community, because in North America, most of the academic learning and services are geared towards the North American population, predominantly white. So, and because of the stigma associated with dementia, people, especially in multi-ethnic groups are very reluctant to talk about dementia because it is one of the highly stigmatized disease all over the world. So what advice that comes to my mind foremost is I think it is up to us to be out there, speak in the public, and be comfortable in talking about dementia. So talking about the disease with your friends, with your family members, I think is the first step towards the community understanding what dementia is, because these communities, these cultures from different ethnic backgrounds have their own religious superstitions and some of way of life that is embedded in their culture, and sometimes they have a very limited, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that, a narrow focus on dementia, because they think some groups may say, this is a punishment from God or from previous and even some cultures believe in afterlife, and they say you must have done something wrong in your previous life. So those are part of the culture that gives us certain challenges in giving that care for people in different multi-ethnic groups. So for us from this different background, it is, I think, important to let the community know that it is okay to talk about dementia. That comfort level needs to be there so that other people could be aware that you are in their community. Most of the times they say, you do not look like you have dementia. So they are very reluctant to admit that you do have this kind of illness.
Cris and Peter, would you like to respond?
I'll go ahead. Mario, thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be with everybody else on this call. I think so often when I am, working to build out other community members who might be experiencing as a caregiver what I'm going through and how I'm supporting my parents along their own journey, oftentimes I'm the only person that looks like me. And I think that, so it's nice to be amongst individuals here now that I feel like from a cultural standpoint and just the affinity towards just some of that background and understanding of just culture and language and perhaps that upbringing and religion in some cases, as Mario, you so eloquently talked about. My parents moved here from the Philippines. They immigrated in 1965 by way of Canada and then into the United States, into Portland, Oregon, where they spent more than 50 years of their life. About a year and some change ago, I made the decision to help move them to North Carolina, where my family is located, so that we can provide better support. Certainly during the pandemic, it was really difficult to be able to manage and really understand their needs. Mario, I think as you talked about, oftentimes specifically as immigrants, they felt a lot of shame. My mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 2017, 2016, 2017. And, she was a prominent person in her community. She had been in healthcare all of her life, caring for others. It was really a mission of hers, and had worked in assisted living care facilities. She had also done foot care to help support even into her retirement, because she felt it was so important to just continue to have those conversations, especially with those with dementia, who are oftentimes forgotten. And I think that taking a page from that and hearing of my father, who was her primary caregiver through those pandemic years, he felt a lot of shame. He felt a lot of personal failure, certainly in both of them being very proud of who they were, what they had accomplished. They talked so much about, we were able to buy a home. We were able to move here with $500 in our pocket. and make a life that all of our children have accomplishments. And that is at the forefront of every conversation they have. Even to this day, they may not remember me, they may not remember my family, but what they do remember is the hardship. And what they do remember is, how difficult it was to make a life here. And so when I think about like what can we share with others in our own experiences, it's really having that understanding, particularly as somebody that's caring for someone that came here from a different country, and how challenging it is without those stories and without that representation, that there may be even a lack of awareness and education as to how to detect the signs earlier, what those symptoms might be. I think that there may have been other kinds of healthcare or other kinds of support that might have been accepted, if I can say that, if it was earlier in the process. When my mom first received her diagnosis, it was like they both stuck their head in their sand. And my mom, busily from her background was writing notes. And as I went into their home to clean out their home, to sell it, to be able to help to provide some supportive care in place for us here, I was finding all these little notes all over the place. And it was that realization of that social masking that she was doing, because she just didn't want anybody to know. She wanted everything to be normal. And so with that, everything to be normal, not only did they not have conversations with each other, but it was almost as if their children weren't allowed to have conversations. And therefore, we couldn't seek the support of our extended family members for fear that we might disrespect them in some way.
Yeah, just listening to both Mario and Chris, I'm just like nodding, because like I can completely relate, from Chris as a caregiver. I can absolutely relate, being a caregiver for my father. And also hearing Mario, Mario's diagnosed with vascular dementia. That's what my father has had. In addition to that, he's had, a couple of strokes. And Jessica, as you know, I was actually in the hospital most of February because my dad had yet another major stroke. So it's been an interesting journey for me. Just thinking about my parents as immigrants, how hard they worked to kind of put me and my brother so that they can make sure that we're successful. And then now seeing my dad, he's been deteriorating. I think he's been diagnosed with the vascular dementia, I think for about, gosh, you know, 7 or 8 plus years, but his progression in terms of how fast he deteriorated has, I would say, like, has been extremely, fairly significant, right? So he just completely requires feeding. He can't really stand anymore. He has a hard time swallowing. That progression is like a step function drop every time sort of some major thing comes up once in a while. So it's been extremely difficult, especially on my mom. So I would say in terms of what are the 1 or 2 key lessons I've learned, there are actually two to be specific. And I think, maybe Mario and Chris has both touched upon that. Number one, I would say, being in an Asian community and our culture, it's actually super important to be super proactive and get that holistic picture, because oftentimes, we react to a point in time emergency or crisis. So everyone rallies around the emergency and the crisis, and we miss that holistic picture because this, whether it's dementia, Alzheimer's, etc., this ailment is evolutionary. It changes over time, and what you need changes over time. And as soon as you think you're stable, something else changes, and your needs change. So it's important to get that holistic picture so that you can kind of get ahead of it, and you know what kind of needs that you will need either as a caregiver or as you as taking care of somebody else. I think that's super important as reason number one. Reason number two is there are actually a lot of people. I mean, just listening to Mario and Chris, like everyone has gone through these experiences, so you don't need to reinvent the wheel. I know, it's always great to hear from people who look like you, etc. And I think that really, really helps. But just don't reinvent the wheel, because this journey, either as a caregiver or as a person living with it, it can be tiring. It is a marathon. And so, if you just always just kind of jump into point in emergency, jumping into it, you will exhaust yourself. I would say that's important point number two. And then number three, just again, the reason to be proactive and holistic is because I think when you get ahead of it and get that holistic picture, you can actually get the right teams in place and the right, like the PTs, the OTs, the STs, get your diet, monitoring your vitals, putting some kind of activities, routine, structure, and, start to put some more joy and love, because time may be limited, but at the same time, I think there's this term people keep talking about, which is you can increase your health span versus your lifespan. Because, while you can live a long time, the quality may not be as good, but you can, if you can increase that health span, that quality with you and your loved ones, I think that's super important. And you can do that by by being proactive and getting that holistic view. So that's my advice, number one. Number two is also being more open to help. I think Cris was touching upon that. As an Asian community, my dad has, the dementia and stroke. So my mom is a primary caregiver, and coming from an Asian culture, she felt like it was her duty, was her responsibility, and she literally took the whole thing upon herself to just take care of my dad. And it's extremely hard, she basically had a knee replacement because she was trying to lift my dad, and my dad is like, 2.5 times her size back in the day. So she actually messed up her knee by trying to do it, it's just like a jerking motion to try to lift him up. And then, she's been so tired, recently she got diagnosed with a tumor in her thyroid. So I'm trying to troubleshoot that with her as well. And she's just so tired. She stays up late at night, get up feeding him. Her schedule's really just off. And so like, I was like, wow, like mom, like I was looking at her, like her pupils. I was like, wow, like your eyes have turned yellow. I was like, there's something wrong with you. So just being open to help, because you might run yourself to the ground. And, in my case, like I want to obviously spend some good time with my dad, but I don't want to lose my mom as well. So I would just say those two things: be proactive and get the holistic picture, number one. Number two is just being more open to help.
Oh, so many great points. Mario and Cris, did you want to react at all to?
I just want to salute Cris and Peter, because a caregiver caregiving is such a challenging area wherein there's such a thing called the 36-hour day. 24 hours is not enough because there's so much to do. You're almost to be there every minute, and sometimes it's very hard on your psyche, on your mind, physically and emotionally. So for family members, it is, especially with Peter's mom, those are challenging things, taking care of your loved one, seeing them slowly reverting to certain sort of activities or actions. You feel like, oh, I see him as an engineer. I see him as such a professional with great demeanor. And now he cannot even unbutton his shirt or put on his shoes. So these are emotional baggages that we need to look at, that is very hard, very difficult to understand. And caregivers, I believe, you will forgive me when I say this, that caregivers bear most of the burden, more than the person with dementia, because person with dementia sometimes may no longer be aware of what's going on, but the caregivers and family partners see this kind of progression towards the capacity to look after themselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Mario. Well, why don't we move on to the second question then? All of you in your responses to the first one touched a little bit about culture. And I know in our previous podcast series, you've done that as well, but I would love just to unpack it a bit more. What are some key points that you wish people who aren't part of the Asian community be aware of so that they can better understand and support individuals from the Asian community who live with or care for someone with dementia? Mari, would you like to go first?
First, I have to say that I share the same challenges of immigrating to a white culture, and Chris, I have $300. Your dad has $500, so I have less money when I came in here. So, but but it's such a good story, and you tell about the challenges of uprooting yourself from your native country and going to a foreign area wherein you are challenged by the environment and the people that live in it. And to answer your question, the next subject of this conversation is that culture really play a role in the delivery of care for people in different countries, because in the South Asian community, which is rich in different cultures, some of them, some of those cultural nuances may prevent people from accessing care. For example, some Chinese communities feel like the oldest son is responsible for the welfare of their children, and to seek help from outside resources is a sign of failure in some communities, because it is sometimes an agreed upon, that's not the word, but I cannot remember it, that the eldest son specifically is responsible for looking after their parents. And in some communities, religion plays an important part, and sometimes there's some communities that look at the afterlife, your life before you are here, so they may think that is a punishment from previous behavior in your previous life. Or sometimes their culture that says that is a punishment from God, and therefore you cannot do anything about it. So those are the nuances. And sometimes there's also another culture that looks at dementia as a stigmatizing disease that would prevent the marriageability of their children, because they will inherit the same kind of illness. This is and sometimes as medical care providers, they may need to understand this culture, not to contradict this culture, but rather how do you parallel this service so that they are not in conflict and you respect these types of culture in your community. And because in Canada, it's a soup of multi-ethnicity that you really need to understand its culture. So in some medical care providers, they provide meals in Chinese culture and other communities, or sometimes we need to look at the diet of the indigenous group. So these are the things that I am privileged to work with the hospitals in looking at the sensitivity of the culture. So I'll stop there for now, and maybe if I think something else. Thank you.
Thanks, Mario. Chris?
Mario, I'm going to pick up where you talked a little bit about food. And, Peter, you spoke very clearly around nutrition and really looking at the holistic view and understanding the care needs of not just what's in that moment, but what's happening over time. I think that, milestones is probably the wrong way to say this, but I think in just the very short period of time that I have been full-time caregiving and now bringing in others to help support longer term care, what was very clear to me is that as somebody that is, depending on definitions, whether I'm first generation or second generation because I was born in the United States, I'm navigating the system of finances and healthcare and education alongside my parents for the first time. And so while I'm learning how to make sure that I'm saving for my retirement, making sure that I'm looking at what insurance looks like, understanding how to navigate a healthcare system and insurance and the complexities that's here in the United States because we don't have that holistic care provided for all of our citizens. I think that has been one of the most challenging pieces when I think about the kinds of really understanding the lived experiences of immigrants, understanding how to provide that additional support. I mean, oftentimes there's just simply trust. Not quite sure because of the lack of representation of those that may understand those challenges that they've come before, or perhaps just the notion that they're not quite sure how to ask for help and don't want that to be looked upon them as they, they don't belong here, or, they might not be as intelligent as others. And I think that by large part was a lot of this fake it till you make it piece as immigrants, that they didn't know how to ask for help and how to perhaps go to a tax attorney, perhaps go to somebody that could help look at longer term, what might this be? My parents never wanted to burden me or my brothers with their healthcare beyond. I think they always thought that they used their rosaries every day, they went to church every Sunday, and they just thought they were going to fall asleep one day and not wake up. And not ever did they think that they were going to be diagnosed with any form of something that might be cognitively debilitating to them. So when I think about just the financial aspects of getting a power of attorney in place, making sure that you have a medical advocate, and those are things that I think when I speak with others, they're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that I had to get these in place. Like, get them in place before you need them, so then when you need them, you have it, and you can at least pick up from there. The other piece that I might want to say is just from a food and nutrition standpoint. I have my parents lived with us for a while, and then we have 4 children. We both have full-time jobs, and we needed, additional support. So we found a really wonderful community to support them through that. But the piece that's really hard is they're not getting the kinds of food that they are accustomed to. And so that was really hard from a nutrition standpoint of getting them to want to eat. And so it's like we do a lot of supplementing and taking them out and bringing them here, and which is all wonderful. But I think that that's part of that holistic care piece that I think would get them to go further in really adopting this new kind of, supports that are in place of going to activities. They're not really interested in some of those activities. But if you can start with the basics are what are foundational to building trust, to knowing that they're being cared for by all, not just ones that might look like me or their family members. And so that's where I'll kind of leave it at.
Yeah, I just want to build on what both Mario and Chris said. Some of what you guys said really, really like resonated with me. So for those people who are not part of the Asian community, I think I've seen sort of several type of versions. So one would be someone who is a medical professional. They're just so academically good, and they do everything by the book. And sometimes, they, for them, they're like, hey, like, they're so accustomed to the system, like, hey, like just hurry up and do this. So they kind of lack that patience and empathy, because you have to meet where the family is, not like for like what you think is academically correct. And I understand that some doctors, they may see many cases, they just like, well, for them, like as Chris has mentioned, for the family, it's our first time through it. Maybe for the doctors, it's their, like, I don't know, many times through it. Right. So I would just say that for them, I would just say, hey, please be empathetic and be patient. And remember that, for each family, this may be our first time, even though this may be your nth time. I think that's very important. And then two, I guess like another version is, I also met, people, I think this is actually more helpful. So they may not be Asian, but then they have personal experiences that have gone through this. I think oftentimes that has been quite helpful, because they're like, yeah, I totally get you. You can just sense the empathy there. And that like I'll give you some examples. So, let's go back to food, right? So, my dad was at the hospital brought in hospital food, and then we try to feed him. This was not what he was used to eating. And then he started to aspirate, and he actually then caught pneumonia, even though he went in for a stroke. So, we're like, hey, unfortunately I wasn't there. And so they were feeding him, and that made him worse. I was like, hey, we eat something different. So let me bring what we've been used to. That's what my dad will eat. It's a certain consistency, it's a certain type of food, we puree it. Yes, it's all puree, but it makes a huge difference, because what ended up happening was the hospital actually says, well, oh my gosh, your dad can't eat. So let's put him on a feeding tube. And you have two options for feeding tubes. And so they were immediately jumping to, like, let's solve it. And I was like, okay, well, hold on. Like I know he can eat. And so I had to reel them back. So I think that was something that really struck me. And of course, it'd be awesome, if we actually had, people who, of course, like, Mario and Chris, we're also spread apart. But I was like, oh man, like, if there's someone who's gone through it and who looked, like me or my parents, I think my mom would be way more open. She'd be like, oh my gosh, I think she would actually be very open and actually more aggressive in kind of asking these questions, versus a lot of times, I think Chris mentioned it, she kind of is hesitant, or English is not her first language. So sometimes the doctor talked really fast, and then she didn't want to ask, because she's like, oh man, I missed it. Maybe I'll just ask me. And or she's like, oh man, I don't want to seem stupid, because it seems, I think there's a lot of that happening. So I would just say that, for those again who are not part of the Asian community, be patient, be empathetic. Remember, this is people's first time. And also, if there are Asian resources, and sometimes, there may not be, but also, please offer those, or bring them into the room, right? And I think I also know doctors. I was a little shocked, because unless I did the research and then I start to ask, they actually didn't tell me. And I was like, well, it seems like you know it, so why did you just tell me, versus me having to, like, reinvent the wheel and research myself. So that's what I would say.
Thanks, Peter. All great points. Again, I'll just ask, would anybody else like to add anything?
Peter, you struck a chord with me. So my parents and their community, they were recently moved into just a different level of care. And what was really interesting is that, there is trauma in move, right? There's that moment of time where everything just all of a sudden changed. And so my mom became what they will call, she was confused. And I will say, well, she was just in a different timeline, because
Yes.
her environment wasn't familiar. So it's even things like the language of what you're sharing with caregivers that feels alarmist, and kind of just goes down to, well, this is what we always do when people that are confused go into, versus let's take a moment to just look at what their timeline looks like, where they are in that moment. And what was interesting to me was they immediately wanted to go into well, we need to go and put them another place and lock them away, what it felt like, versus we had one Filipina caregiver that in that moment stepped away from what she was doing and just started looking like straight into my mom and just asked her, like, oh, where are you? And speaking a bit in Tagalog, a bit in English, to kind of bring her back circle to understanding a little bit of where she was. And it just completely, diffused whatever was happening in that moment. And I think that the caregivers just went, oh. And it just took everybody a moment. And then we had a caregiving meeting, and I just said, can we have a conversation about that moment in time? And I think this is just a really good example of ways that we can both mitigate perhaps what might have not been the right thing for them at that time, to just say, hey, let's just take a moment. And because you do have somebody that is representative of who they are. They look, and my mom immediately goes, because she believes that she's in the Philippines, and she'll look and she'll like, oh, you're here too. And then it just, I feel like if we can look towards as caregivers, when we look at the populations of those that have increasing needs, that becomes, and this goes back to the holistic piece of how do we make sure that we are educating, that we are building a talent pipeline, that we are hiring in support of the communities that right now have a disproportionate impact and may not have access to the kinds of, services, support, education, that could really, support more of the populations that are experiencing this condition.
Actually, thank you both. What both of you said actually triggered something else, or reminded me of something else, which is, I feel like the medical system, definitely in the US, and I can't really speak for Canada. It truly is functionally based versus patient based. And so my experience is, I think even in the ER, they're trying to, get you out of there and basically push you to, the hospital, or like every function is just trying to hand you off to the next function. And also, like, even in the hospital, they kind of run different shifts. So no one actually has your story. Everyone's just there to do a task. For example, they come in, they basically, one person just does the blood draw, one person does the changing, one person does the vitals, and then different doctors come in, and then there's different shifts. Everyone's just there to do their part. And then sometimes I feel like it's being punted to like the next function or the next function. So they're just trying to suggest like, okay, well, since your dad's not as reactive, not eating, let's put a feeding tube. Or have you thought about hospice? Maybe let's put him there immediately. So they're just trying to solve it functionally versus being patient-centric, which is like, like, hey, like, what is this person, like, what has worked for this person? It may not follow the medical academia to the T, but hey, it works. When you put people who look, like Cris was mentioning, people who look like, being in a very familiar place, the person completely changes. It was like night and day. It's true for my dad as well. So in some ways, that's what we're trying to get him out of the hospital as quickly as possible. So that actually reminded me, which is, what are some of the things that I don't know, it's non-Asian. I think just in general, because the example that I think of is, when you get pregnant and when you deliver a baby, there's actually something called a doula. And a doula actually advocates for you, and then they kind of know the hospital rules and says, hey, and also as a baby, I mean, it's obviously very different. People's like, oh my God, something new, something exciting. We'll do whatever it takes. Everyone's on top of it. I also feel like this is the unfortunate part. As you get older, you get to the end of your life. Basically, there's no doulas. There's no really advocates for you unless you have family members who serve as that. And also, I don't know, it just becomes less exciting. There's a bit of an ageism at the very end. People's like, well, you're only gonna get worse. So, like, let's just, I don't know, quickly solve this problem, right? So I also think the attitude may be a bit different, and I think that needs to be changed. So yeah.
Oh, so many great points. Thank you all. So our last and final question is this. This is your opportunity to really share what, in your opinion, do you think we should be doing to help raise awareness and shine a light on the lived experiences of those from the Asian community? This is a first start, but what else can we be doing?
I think Cris and Peter are doing a wonderful job in advocating for caregivers. So for people with dementia and caregivers, the South Asian community is very reticent. They are reluctant to share their experiences. It's about time, if you may recall, we talk about something like it's okay to talk about it. So just by starting to say, My father has dementia or whatever, and it's a good start of a conversation. And some people will say, "Oh, they're just getting old," and probably dismiss it. But sometimes we need to say, "This is different. This is something that is very challenging for the family." So but if they don't feel responsive, then go to the next person, and before you know it, you most of the time when I said I have dementia, and I meet people that says, "Oh, my grandma passed away with the same kind of illness." I want to touch on what Chris said earlier about the other people acknowledging the state of the person with dementia, because we need to understand that the reality of a person with dementia is different from the reality. So they may say, "I want to walk my dog," but the dog died five years ago. So I think there is a way of creative conversations wherein we can say something else without contradicting that person. And sometimes you as a daughter they may call you another name, maybe their sisters or whatever. So probably those are opportunities to be creative in answering and not contradicting the person. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're lying. You're just trying to divert the conversation.
No, Mario, you raised exactly what I wanted to raise. I think all of us here believe that for our families and for others that we are advocating for as well, is that we want them to live out their lives with respect and dignity and love and still experience joy. I loved how you talked about just the health span versus lifespan, Peter. And I think in that, some of the things that I'd love to just be able to share with others is that, we talked a little bit about shame, challenges in asking for help. And I think that one of the things that we can do that is not only through the storytelling that we're doing now, that people can help to identify with and feel stronger, because there are others like them in these particular, life season of life. But it's really, I think, almost providing that greater education and prompts. One of the things that I've found that is my mom and dad, my dad now that he's kind of advancing in his own dementia, have found is that people just stopped calling. And it was because they weren't quite sure, well, I don't know how to talk with them because nothing that they say is real. And it's like, well, everything that they say is real. It's just different from where you are. It's where they are today. And so when I began to kind of share, here's how you can show up. If they do ask this, here's how you can help to redirect. If they are getting adamant about wanting to go home to Oregon and be in that house and you're not quite sure, well, you no longer have the house. So how do I share that? You don't. You say, hey, what are you looking most forward to in going home? Going back to Portland. Or if my mom says, oh, so my house in Laguna, she's so excited about that. Well, she hasn't lived in Laguna in 70 plus years. How do I acknowledge that? And it's just helping people to understand how to meet them where they are. And I think that there aren't enough literature out there, at least perhaps that's accessible in the ways that somebody of our culture might accept it or receive it. I think that those are the pieces that we need to kind of help so that they can engage in those different ways. Because it's one thing about storytelling, but then it stops if there's no vehicle to get them to that next place in life.
Yeah, actually, what both Mario and Chris said, yeah, again, really resonates with me, which is their reality is different than our reality. And I do remember that, when my dad was going to go do something else, like go to the post office in the middle of the night or cook something that's really weird. I think this is earlier on. My mom actually tried to correct the behavior, and they kind of got into it. And I remember there one time they kind of got into it, really, my mom was really mad. And then my dad got really mad at the supermarket, and basically he refused to get back in the car with her to kind of come home. So basically, like I remember driving to the supermarket, and basically I tried to calm him down. I literally just stood with him there for like 2.5 hours. And of course, people were looking at us funny, what's going on here? But I told my mom, I basically said, hey, like I, my dad was in a different reality, but you just have to approach it with love and understanding and kindness. And, I think that kind of helped my dad calm down. So what you guys both said, like I think really, really just that really resonates with me because I can just think of incidents and events that these things actually have happened. I would say also to add in terms of what we can do to kind of drive awareness and shine a light, and for those kind of experiencing this in the Asian community, I actually think that what we're doing here now actually helps because I think just hearing more stories of people going through this, I think that's actually really helpful. So in my mind, this is where I think the vision would be good. I don't know how we're going to get there. So here's my vision, which is, people somehow are more open to sharing their stories, and somehow, it's kind of published somewhere. And then at some point, a directory is built out because this is a global disease, but in terms of the help you need, it's very localized. And I do know that the community that my parents live in, I'm sure there are people in a similar age group going through similar challenges, but they don't talk to each other. And it's not their fault. Maybe they're too busy kind of doing their own caretaking. They're just heads down. But literally, there could be another elderly Asian couple down the street that's going through this. It may not be dementia. It could be Parkinson's. It could be Alzheimer's. It's slightly different, but I think that could provide a lot of good support. And if everyone just raised their hand and says, hey, I'm going through this too. And maybe they can actually even help each other. And plus it's much more trusted. It's like, oh, this is my neighbor. Right. But then I don't think those connections are being made. I'll give you an example, which is, I think my mom had a high school friend who lived maybe a city away from her, maybe like, 10, 20 miles. Just not even, maybe just 10 miles max. And her husband was going through the same thing, and they had lost touch. And so like, I was like, wow, like, how come you guys just don't talk more to each other, right? So they just don't know. Again, maybe it's the Asian culture of, okay, this is my problem. Let me go heads down.
Yes.
Let me not bother anybody. I think that openness would go a long way. That's what I would say. And I know, Jessica, you've been trying to rally the number of people to do this podcast from time to time. He's like, oh my gosh, it's so hard. So that's my vision, but in terms of execution, I don't know how we get there. But that'll be amazing.
That would be amazing. Well, thank you. We're almost out of time. So I want to pause here to say a special thank you. Thank you, Mario. Thank you, Cris. Thank you, Peter, for showing up so bravely and authentically and sharing your lived experiences, as well as your great advice. Not only to you, I also want to thank anyone who's participated in Calling All Voices from the Asian community. We need to hear more stories so that we can pull these rich insights into raising awareness and helping not only each other cope and manage better, but also for future generations. So thank you so much for all of your time. Truly, we're grateful. Our goal with Calling All Voices is to shine a light on some of the real life needs and challenges that people living with dementia and their care partners have experienced so that we can learn what else we can do to best support people from diverse communities, including the Asian community. To learn more, make sure you check out Dementia Action Alliance website to read the white papers and view the podcast interviews informed by people who are part of the Black, LGBTQ+, Hispanic, Latinx, and Asian communities. Thank you all so much for joining us. And again, thank you to our amazing guest speakers.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode of Calling All Voices. If you're interested in learning more, please visit Dementia Action Alliance and/or the Global Council on Alzheimer's Disease websites for resources and information on Calling All Voices. The creation of this podcast was sponsored by Otsuka Pharmaceutical Development and Commercialization Incorporated. This podcast is not, however, intended to provide medical advice. The views, thoughts, and opinions represented herein solely belong to the individuals sharing their experiences and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Otsuka Pharmaceutical Development and Commercialization Incorporated or its affiliates. If you have specific questions, medical questions that is, by all means, contact your healthcare provider. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please make sure to subscribe to this series and share a review and let others know what you heard and or experienced on today. I'm Dr. Tan, and bye for now.